Hello, this is a lesson on stasis theory. My subtitle is An Introduction to the Elements of Organizing an Argument and How to Evaluate a Research Topic. Stasis theory is probably a new thing to you. I always like to introduce it in Comp 2 because I think it has a lot of value in organizing our own arguments and to help us really just break down what it is we're trying to say. Because oftentimes we come into a research and argument class thinking we have this big idea to solve all the world's problems. And as you've already figured out, that I'm not asking you to solve the world's problems, I'm asking you to look at something very specific and focused. So, stasis theory is going to help us not only write a better paper, but help us evaluate and organize what we're trying to say and do. So, stasis theory goes back just over 2,000 years uh, to Aristotle and this guy Hippocrates of Timnos. I don't know who he is, but it's about between 300 to 100, late 100s BC. It was refined by Cicero, who gave us a lot of laws. So these are the ancient Greeks. And stasis theory was used as part of the legal proceedings. And later on, it became realized that we can use this for basically all writing. And I'll show you kind of how stasis theory is unwittingly part of everything we write. So there are four parts to stasis theory. There's fact, definition, evaluation, and call to action. Now, I'm getting a lot of these examples and questions in the early part of this lesson from the Purdue OWL. I'm taking it, the definitions, or not the definitions, but descriptions of these four areas straight from Purdue OWL. But I do have two other lessons on stasis theory. They're a little bit older, but they cover basically the same sort of thing. The idea, though, of course, is that in stasis theory, you have to move from one to the next. So you have to establish your fact before you can really define them. And then you have to define them before you can evaluate. And you can only go to a call to action or a policy based on your evaluation. So everything needs to logically follow. In legal proceedings in ancient Greece, it was there a crime? What was the nature of the crime? What was the impact of the crime? And what is proper restitution or punishment for this crime? Those are those questions, So was fact, how is it defined? What's the quality of it? And then what do we do about it? So we're going to move on to looking at part one. Part one is the facts. Now, there's a series of questions to ask, and you don't have to ask them all, but you can start looking at them all. And you can do this by looking at your topic. What has happened? What do we know? What is the problem? I mean, not what is it, but is there actually a problem with it? Too many times we look at an argument and it's calling for a solution to a problem that really doesn't exist. So is it really a problem? What began it? So we'll look at causation a little bit later too. But what changed? Can this thing that we're looking at be changed? Where do we get our data and information? Are these sources reliable? How do we know these sources are reliable? So it's asking a lot of really interesting and good questions. Some of them are for your topic, and some of them might be for you to evaluate your sources. These last two questions are really for evaluating sources, but the idea is that we need to make sure our audience is all on the same page, that we're talking about the same thing, and that we're moving forward. Because if everybody is arguing, well, we can't do anything, then you have to convince people first that something can be changed. And so some of you are looking at climate change, and some of the arguments are like, well, humans can't impact climate, right? And so that makes everything a non-starter. How do you instead of arguing, well, we have to do all these things, you first have to convince people that, yes, we can do something to impact the environment. So that really depends on your angle of approach, and it helps define what it is you're going to be focusing on in your topic. Next is definition. Once you've established your facts, you need to go into part two. It looks for more clarification. So what is the nature of this problem? So we have a problem. What is the nature of it? What exactly is this problem? What kind of problem or issue is it? And you might look at, well, is it part of something bigger? Or is it broken up into parts? And how are these parts related? Right? So if there's multiple parts of this problem, you might have to tackle each one individually. Who or what is influencing our definition? of this problem or issue. So when you start looking at how people are talking about these issues, you might start looking at, well, what's causing them to use this terminology or um, their outlook? What causes their outlook or leads to their outlook? And why are these sources or beliefs influencing our definition? So maybe there's a cultural issue that's going on, a cultural belief or a religious belief or a moral belief um, that is severely impacting or even limiting our ability to discuss the issue. We have to address those things as well, because we might not ever get past the idea of climate change and saying we have to do something about it if you can't convince people that it is a problem, or you have to battle uphill to convince people that, well, moralistically, it's an issue that should influence you and concern you. So you really have to say, well, there's micro problems within this bigger issue that I have to address, and that might be the focus of your paper. But we're looking at establishing common ground. Now, part 2A is causation. I'm calling it part 2A. I would really call it part 3 in class and break stasis theory into 5 parts. But not every issue has a cause, and so that's why it's not really part of it. Part 1 talked about cause a little bit, but you can break it down even further. How do we know it's the cause? What led up to the cause? Who's responsible? Is it deliberate? Was it a choice? Are there alternatives if it was a choice? You don't always have to explore causation, but I think it's good to look at, because people like to point to causes as a way of scapegoating or creating excuses. And when I talk about how we use stasis theory in our writing or everyday lives, I will point out how we often jump to causation first. Now keep in mind that we have to go from part 1 to part 2 to part 3 to part 4. So causation can only be established after establishing facts and definitions. So I'll keep that in mind. Part 3 is evaluation. Once we've established that there's an issue and we're all speaking that same language, we get to look at some other things. Is this a good thing or a bad thing? So we've established there's a thing. We've broken it down. Now we get to look at the nature of it. Hey, this is actually good, or this is actually bad. How serious is it? Who does it affect, or harm or benefit? And that you'll recall from our first topic exploration sheet. I asked that question. Who does this thing hurt or benefit? Can we actually address this issue? Can it be solved? What happens if we don't do anything? And what are the costs of solving? Are we going to spend $8 billion doing something that only helps 2 people? Or, is that a practical issue? These are things that we have to start to look at. Who or what is influencing our determination of the seriousness of this problem, and why are they influencing our determination? So these, again, as you're evaluating your sources, will be useful to look at. All these things are going to lead to a logical conclusion or a call to action. So I call it a call to action, which is the same part of the paper that you're writing, but it could be a policy decision. So we might say, well, all policies, rules, laws, or whatever are created because of a reason. They've been evaluated because they've been taken through this stasis theory. We at least hope, right? So we have to say, well, I'm sorry. This happens all the time because I don't do this in full presentation view. So, should something happen? Should we take action? Who should be involved with addressing the issue? What should be done? And what needs to happen to make this work? How do we know we're successful? See, these are general problem-solving questions. How do we know we've done something, and how do we know it's actually beneficial? When you're looking at your sources, you can be asking questions, well, what is influencing or determining how we view what we're trying to do with the problem, and how are these sources or beliefs influencing our determination? Similar questions to evaluation, but we're looking at justifying our actions. So let me get back to the next part. Why use stasis theory? I think it helps us evaluate and form arguments. Many arguments or persuasive pieces make assumptions about fact, definition, and causation. They might assume that we all agree because, we're all Americans, or we're all in Ohio, or we're all Christians, or whatever. And that might not be the case. We might all be of a certain group, but we have different interpretations of what it means to be a member of that group. And it creates broad evaluative statements that, later on we'll learn that these are logical fallacies, but it leads to policies. X is bad, so ban it. So, you'll see that. Well, marijuana is bad, so we need to ban it. Or people die in gun violence, so we need to ban all guns. Or vice versa. We don't know that marijuana is bad. Some people like it, and so therefore we need to make sure it's legal. Or not all people with guns are out there shooting everybody, so why hurt everybody's rights to protect a few people or to stop a few people when obviously the laws don't work? So those are interesting questions, but we don't go far back enough because we'd rather have these easy, simple solutions that don't apply to every situation, but just say, well, that's just the way it is, instead of really exploring these issues further on. So stasis theory allows us to start at the beginning and then create an argumentative flow. So I'm going to give you an example, and I use this example in my first video lesson, which is you've broken curfew. It's 1 o'clock, you're way late, and whenever I do this exercise in class, I always have students give me 85 different reasons on why they broke curfew or excuses, right? I got stuck in traffic at 1 a.m., right? My car wouldn't start. I had to take a friend home. I lost track of time, right? It's all, I broke curfew and it's not my fault. And we have to see the faulty in that logic. If you're using stasis theory, you're jumping to a conclusion, a causation that assumes the facts and definitions are already agreed upon. It's an admission of guilt. We should really start looking at, you can make an argument about the fact you had a curfew that night. It was agreed upon by both parties, and you acknowledge that you had a curfew, right? When you admit guilt, you go right to cause. You're acknowledging all these things. Instead, you can say, no, we didn't have a curfew. You only said on the weekends it's Thursday night, or it's Friday night. Friday night's not a weekend. Or I didn't agree to 11 o'clock as a curfew. So those are, probably not going to fly with your parents, but it's part of how we can use stasis theory to really start to break things down. You can do some definitions, right? What does curfew mean? You didn't tell me I had to be home by 11. You told me to be safe, right? When was curfew? You said it was 11. I heard 1 o'clock, right? And what were the expectations of curfew? Oh, I had a curfew. I was at a friend's house. You knew where I was, right? And those are interesting questions. What do we actually mean by curfew? They don't specifically say, I want you home and in bed by 11. Perhaps there's some flexibility. Now we haven't gone over causation. Then you can establish some evaluations or quality, right? What are the consequences of breaking curfew? Did anything really bad happen? Does anything ever bad happen after 11 o'clock, right? Can those bad things happen before 11 o'clock when you're supposed to be home, right? You could be in a car wreck driving home at 11 o'clock. That doesn't make you any safer just because you're home, right? Or you're on your way home. So why is curfew even necessary? I'm 16, I'm 18, I'm 35. I don't need a curfew. Is this a regular occurrence? This is the first time I broke curfew, and it was for a good cause. Or, I always break curfew. I'm never home in time. Nothing ever happens, both punishment-wise or bad to me. So, those are questions to look at. And then there's call to action. Will punishment fix the broken curfew? You ground me every time and I'm still late. Or your threats hold no teeth, and so I can just continue to break curfew with impunity and you're not going to do anything. I'm going to sneak out anyway. Or, I don't think you trust me and that's why you have curfew. I would be home at a reasonable hour anyway, and I stay out late now just to spite you. All right. So those are interesting questions and that you can use to really examine whether or not, curfew's there. And we can use it in writing, and I always use my thank you note for grandma as an example. So you're writing a thank you note to grandma for a birthday gift. We know that the facts are you were given a gift. It came from grandma, who's on a fixed income. She gives everyone gifts. You're old enough not to need a gift, but you're glad, right? She gave you $20. That's the definition. It was a nice card. She wrote a nice note, things like that. Evaluation, she gave you a gift out of love and kindness. It wasn't needed. Wasn't expected. So those are good things as evaluation, because you appreciate it. And call to action, it needs to be acknowledged. So you write, "Dear Grandma, thank you very much for sending me the lovely card and check for my birthday. I really appreciate all the nice things you said in the card. I truly feel loved. I also appreciate the check, though it isn't necessary. I'll put the money to good use by saving it, or I might spend it on something fun. I'll fill you in when I do. I know you have a lot of grandchildren, and we're a lot to keep track of. All my friends are jealous of how great my grandma is. I can't wait to see you the next holiday. Love, your Snooky Pookie," or whatever you're called, right? But we go through stasis theory because you don't just say, "Grandma, thanks." You have to tell her what for. And, you're spending time anyway writing a note. You just don't say, "Thanks. Thanks for the cash, lady." You say things that show your gratitude, right? So you're showing your evaluation, and you write that thank you note, and you might actually hope that writing thank you notes will be incentive for Grandma to keep sending you money. And there's a lot of other ways we can use stasis theory, and you can examine writing and see that you have to establish facts at the very beginning and your definition. So when you're evaluating a topic, you might think, okay, well, one topic that people were looking at was climate change, and someone was talking about pollution. Well, there's a lot of facts you could start to explore, right? Facts. Does pollution impact climate change? That's the first question. What kind of pollution are we talking about? Who is producing this pollution? How much pollution is there? Is this pollution necessary? And there's a list of questions you can ask, and that's going to narrow down. Okay, well, maybe it's auto emissions, or maybe it's factory emissions, or maybe it's some other type of pollution that we can't really control. Which pollutions are affecting climate change? Or facts. Is pollution actually a problem? What kind of pollution? So you might say, okay, well, do individual acts have an impact on pollution, or is there something else? And so you narrow down a specific type of pollution that you want to examine or follow. Then third reasoning or fact is, where is this pollution happening? What is the main source of this pollution? Why is it happening? What led up to it? When did it become a problem? There's all sorts of questions you can combine all these things. So if you're looking at industrial pollution, well, when did it happen, and when did we start to notice it was a problem, and is it too late to do anything? And all of these can be an entire focus of your paper. So we might say, okay, well, single-use plastic, that's a huge issue. We've seen the videos of sea turtles with straws stuck in their nose, and whales with all sorts of plastic waste in their stomach that's killing them. So we might say, well, what is single-use plastic? How do we identify it? Why is it a problem? It's getting in our waterways. How is it a problem? Animals are ingesting it. And then what is being done about it? Right now, nothing. Some states and countries are enacting plastic bans, things like that. We might look at what is a single-use plastic? Why are they so prevalent? How do they cause problems? What are these problems? And can these problems be solved? Are we at a point of no return? Evaluations, right? Why is single-use plastic produced? Why are they used? Are there alternatives? Why aren't alternatives being used? So you might say, well, why are we using plastic bags instead of paper bags at the grocery stores, right? Or why can't we provide more incentives for people to bring their own bags? Things like that. It's being done on the small scale, but not the large scale. So what can be done? What has been done? And what is effective? And what can be better? And that starts to lead to your call to action. But really, this is how you would maybe form a paper, but you have to ask a billion questions before you actually figure out what it is you're going to say. So stasis theory is a great start to help you find how you're going to approach your topic, to establish facts in your definitions. Your research is going to lead you through to your evaluation and call to action. But don't start off with plastic's bad, let's ban it. You have to really start to develop, because that's just too big of a case to make for this paper. Instead, you can make smaller cases for your topic, and that's really what I want to look at. Specific things. You might work backwards. Someone's calling for this to happen. Well, it's a response to this other thing. Is this a good idea? What are the facts that we know of? And then you can say, well, even though people are calling for X to happen, we should probably look at doing this. And it creates a whole new approach to your argument. So give stasis theory a try. We'll look at how we can use it later on, but hopefully this was helpful and useful to you. Please let me know if you have questions.